Welcome back. This is video 1 in the Intro to Grasshopper tutorial, technically the second video in the series, but the first after the summary and the first that we're jumping into Grasshopper. In this tutorial, I'll assume you know nothing about Grasshopper and maybe a little about Rhino, but I think you should still be fine even if you know nothing about Rhino either. The kind of basic and broad goal of this tutorial is to translate some very simple math, some geometry, some ratios, etc. from the pattern we see in a glass sponge into something we can work with in Grasshopper, into the language of Grasshopper so we can have this pattern in Rhino. What we'll be doing in this video, since this is an Intro to Grasshopper tutorial, is using some of the basic Grasshopper functions, some basic components to make a flat surface. And this surface is going to be one of several that we'll be applying our glass sponge pattern to. So to get started, I'm just going to zoom into this view in the corner by double-clicking on the perspective tag. And then if you want to change views, you can go down here to the left. This is the top view, front and right. They all look the same for now, except for the perspective. And to open up Grasshopper, you can either click on this Launch Grasshopper icon up here, or you can just type Grasshopper and enter, and up pops Grasshopper. But before we start modeling this surface, I'm going to go over a little bit about where the geometry lives in Grasshopper. So I'm going to use a different file here to go over something that can be kind of tricky in Grasshopper and Rhino, but it's something you'll get used to very fast, but it's worth mentioning right now. So I'm going to double click on the perspective and grab a circle button and just draw a circle over here. And then I'm going to say File, Save. So this Rhino file has a circle in it. Now I just clicked this to open Grasshopper. And I'm going to double click on the canvas and I'm going to start typing construct point. And that's going to put a point at the origin, but this point isn't actually in the Rhino file. It's only in this Grasshopper file. So Rhino is kind of like a window into a Grasshopper file. It's a way to see what's in a Grasshopper file. When it's interacting with Grasshopper specifically, it's kind of like the They Live glasses or 3D glasses or just regular glasses, I guess. There's nothing actually in these glasses, but through this window, it makes whatever is in Grasshopper easier to understand visually. It shows the geometry. Of course, Rhino's much more than this, but its role here is kind of like that, just showing what's in Grasshopper. It's a way to see what's in a Grasshopper file, but it doesn't actually contain the geometry right away. So I'm going to get a circle component by typing circle. And this circle takes an input. This circle component takes an input of a point and a radius. I'm just hovering over and it's telling me what it wants. So now I'm going to just type in 5. I just double clicked on the canvas and typed 5. And this is going to give me a number slider between 0 and 10 with 5. It's set at 5 right now. Then I'll put that in for the radius. Let's put this up to 10. So now we can see a circle here and a circle here. This circle is only in Rhino, and this circle is only in Grasshopper. You can see that when I go like this to select it, nothing happens, but when I go like this to select the one that's in Rhino, it gets selected. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to go File, New, and press Open, or let's grab large objects, feet and inches, or let's just do meters. Open. So I just made a brand new file, and if I go into perspective, or in any of these views actually, this one you can't see it because it's just a straight line. This is the front view, but from the top view you can see this circle. From perspective you can see it there. The circle that's in Grasshopper is still showing up in this Rhino window, but it's not actually in this Rhino file. And so if you're done using Grasshopper at any time, go ahead and just click this X. Whatever was in Grasshopper will disappear, and you can start working in Rhino again, and then you can just click that to reopen Grasshopper, and it'll automatically open whatever you had open before. And you can have multiple files open at the same time. They're all up here. So I'll say File, Save Document. Let's go to the desktop and sample folder. We'll say Sample 1, Save. Then I can say File, New Document. And now that I have a blank canvas, There's nothing showing up here because there's nothing in my Rhino or in my Grasshopper. But I can, if I want to go back to the other one, I can just click up here and then go down to sample. And now we have this Grasshopper file open again. And if I want this circle to exist inside Rhino, I can go to this component. This is where the circle lives, inside this component. I know that by clicking on it and then it turns green. If I want it to be in Rhino and not only in Grasshopper, then I can right click here and say bake. And then it's going to ask me what layer do I want to bake it on. These are all the layers that exist in my Rhino file. I can push OK. And now we have a circle on the default layer. And I can select it. It's actually in Rhino. And if I close this, then it's actually in the Rhino file. And if we want to go the other way around, I can just type Grasshopper this time, and that'll open Grasshopper back up. Let's say I want to bring geometry from from Rhino into Grasshopper. Then I'm going to get what's called a curve component. So this holds curves. Or I could have selected a circle component. This one, we selected this one last time. This component makes a circle. This one just holds a circle. So I can select either one of these, right click, and go to set one circle. If I have a lot of circles I want to set, I go to set multiple circles, and they'd all be in the same component. But I'm going to say set one circle. Actually, it's going to have me draw a circle, so maybe circle isn't the best way to do it. Now I have a new circle, and if I close this, that circle's actually not in, it never was in Rhino. But I'm going to open this back up, and if I want to go set one curve, now I can go and just click on that curve, and now this circle exists in this curve component in Grasshopper. So this all might be a little confusing right now. Don't worry, this will be very natural in no time at all. Okay, now we can start making our surface. So I'm going to start by constructing a point in Grasshopper. It's nice to have everything in this file here, in the Grasshopper file. That way you only have to keep track of one file. You can also reference geometry from Rhino into Grasshopper. And if you still want to keep everything in the Grasshopper file, you can internalize it, but we'll get to that later. So for now, I'm just going to construct a point, and we'll start from a single point in the Grasshopper file. So double click on the canvas and type construct point. And there we have a point at the origin showing up in our Rhino viewport. So because this grid can get a little distracting, I'm going to hide it. So I'm going to click over in the Rhino viewport and type grid, enter, and then you have this list of options up here. And over here it says show grid access, yes, and underlined is the O. So if I type O and enter, the access will disappear. And if I type H and enter, the grid will disappear. And so show grid, now it's on no. And then I just type escape, and I've exited out of the grid properties. So back to the Grasshopper canvas. This component constructs one point, or several, depending on the inputs. But for now, since there are no inputs, we haven't put anything into these three inputs. It's assuming default values, which are 0, 0, and 0, and that's why the point is at the origin. And so if we want to change that, we can get a number slider. So I just double click on the canvas again, and there are several ways to get a number slider. You can just type in a number like 5, and that's going to give you a number slider from 1 to 10, and the numbers are all going to be integers. So I'll delete that. Or you can double click and type in a range of numbers. So I can say 0.000 less than 20. And that's going to give me a number slider between 0 and 20. And because I typed 3 decimal places, this is going to have a resolution of 3 decimal places. So instead of just integers, these are real numbers with 3 decimal places. And another thing you can do is double click and type a range with a number in the middle. And so we can say -20 less than 0 less than 20.000. And so that's going to give me a number slider between -20 and 20. And because I put 0 in the middle, it's going to automatically set it to 0. And so I'll do that again. -20 less than 0 less than 20.000. And these are real numbers between -20 and 20. And if I don't want to do that again, I can click on this, hold Alt for Windows. I'm not sure what it is on a Mac. Drag. And when I let go, I've just copied this slider. And so this is exactly the same as this one. And we can plug these points into our X, Y, and Z coordinates. And now we can change the position of this point however we want. So this is going to be our starting point. And we'll start this tutorial off by making a few different simple surfaces. And this will be a good way to go through some of the most common components. And we can use these surfaces to apply our glass sponge pattern. So once we have a few different surfaces, we can kind of demonstrate how the sponge or the glass sponge pattern translates to different kinds of surfaces. So next, I will get a point component by typing point. So it's fastest to just double click and type the name of the component that you want. But if you're not familiar with the names of the components, you can search through them. All the components are organized in these tabs up here. Right now we're in the primitive tab, or the params tab, just the basic tab, and we have primitive over here and geometry over here. And point is the simplest geometry. It's right here. So you could have, instead of just typing point, gone under geometry and grabbed point from there. But it's good to get to know the names of all of these, and they'll come with time, and just type them into the canvas. So anyway, I'm going to put this point that we constructed here into this point component, just so that we have a way to easily identify what this point is, and we're going to use this point often. So I'm going to give it a name, start point. And so to give it a name, just right click on the component and you can change what that component is called up here. Since we might use this same point several times, it's nice to know what's in this component rather than just the generic point. And also, since we now have two components with the same point, these are both displaying this point here. So this point lives in this component and this point lives in this component now. And we don't need to see both of them, so I'm going to click on this one and click the middle button. Usually this is just clicking down the wheel on the mouse, and that's going to give me this little circle of options here. This person with a blindfold means disable preview. This person that can see is enable preview. Right now the preview is enabled, so I'm just going to disable the preview. So that's just going to hide whatever's in this component. But we see that the point's still showing. That's because it's in this component. And when the component is highlighted in green, it shows up as in green. So if I were to click the middle button and go to disable preview on this component, then it disappears. But let's keep it enabled for now. And let's move this. So I'm going to double click and type move. And we see a move component here. We're going to plug in the geometry that we want to move into this little G. If you hover over, it'll tell you what this input is expecting. And it's expecting a generic geometry, so any geometry can go into here. And so we'll put our start point into this geometry, and this is expecting a vector. This little black hexagon with an arrow is the symbol for a vector, and it tells you here translation vector. And there is a default, which is 0, 0, 10. That means by default, it's going to move whatever you plug in 10 units in the Z direction. And so a translation vector, you can think of it as an arrow, and it's moving. In this case, the vector is moving whatever geometry we plugged in the direction of that arrow. So to define what direction we actually want to move this point, let's get another component, and this is, let's just type in vector and see what there is. And so if we type in vector, we see vector 2 point. There are several different ones, but the one we want is vector XYZ. Just like the point, the defaults for this are 0, 0, and 0. And so this vector has no length and it's pointing in no direction. So let's get an X and a Y component for these vectors. I'm going to select both of these by holding Shift. After I've selected one, click, Alt, drag, and now I have these sliders again. I'm going to plug these in to the vector. So right now the output isn't connected to anything, so we can't see this vector on the canvas. If you want to see a vector on the canvas, you can type in vector display. and the input here is vector, so let's put the V into the V, and the anchor, or the input here, is called an anchor, and it's just looking for a point. Where do you want to display this vector? Since vectors don't actually have locations, they're just magnitudes and directions, so they're just, if you're working in three-dimensional space, they're just three coordinates that specify a direction. So let's use our start point as the anchor point. So right now this vector is pointing, let's go to the top view to see this. I'm going to type in grid again, H, O. So let's keep O. Let's keep the origin lines. So this is Y and this is X. So with -3 and -5.4, this vector is pointing -3 in the X, so -3.132 actually in this direction, and -5.4 in this direction, because this is the Y direction, vertical, X is horizontal, since we're in the top view. And if we change the X, then it's just going to move horizontally, and it's keeping the Y at -5.42. And if we change the Y, so you can see kind of what this vector is doing, and we anchored it at this point. So if we plug this vector into our translation vector, then it's going to make a new point wherever that vector ends. And I'm keeping Z at 0 since what we're making here is the bottom line of our surface. We want this line to stay on the ground, essentially. And so we don't want we don't want to move this point in the Z direction at all, so that we can have a flat bottom line of our surface. And the surfaces we're going to make, you can think of them as walls, and this is just the bottom line of the wall. I'm going to hide this for now. And now we have 2 points, our start point and our move point, and I'm going to make a line between these 2 points. So I'm going to double click, type line, and there are a few different lines. This is just the generic line component that holds a line in it, kind of like this start point just holds a point. And this is a line AB. So this component is going to make a line from A to B, and A is going to be our start point, and B is going to be our move point. So now we've made a line, and we can change how that line looks. And to get a surface, let's move this line. So now instead of moving just a point, we're going to move an entire line. I'm going to double click, type move, and this is the geometry that we want to move. And again, by default, it's just going to move it 10 in the Z direction. We do want to move it in the Z direction, but maybe not quite 10. So let's get another vector component. So here we got a vector that takes in X, Y, and Z. Now since we just want to move this line in the Z direction, we want to make the height of the surface. You can double click, type Z, and you see unit Z here. This is a vector in the Z direction. And so there's only one input, and the output is going to be a vector in the Z direction with X and Y both 0. So this component here is just like this component here, except for the X and the Y. So let's get a number slider, and now we get to decide what range we want to choose from for the height of our surface. So I'm just going to type something between 1 and, let's say, 40.000. And then we have a Z vector that we can put into our translation vector. And now that we've done that, now we have 2 lines. And we don't need to see these points anymore. So I'm going to select these 2, which are our 2 points, click the middle button, and blindfold, hide the preview. So now we just see 2 lines. One line lives in this component, one line lives in this component, and I would like to put these together in a single component, so I can double click and type in merge. And let's put this line in this input and this line in this input, and it's going to automatically create another input in case I want to put something else in there. But if you zoom in, you can get rid of that. We only need 2 things in this component, and if you click the minus button, it'll get rid of that. You don't need to do that, but you can. And so now we have both lines in this component, so we can hide these. These are just redundant. We can still use them later, but they're just not showing up here. And now that these are merged together, I'm going to get a panel. So I'm going to double click and type 2 slashes like that. And that is the shortcut for a panel. You can do several different things with a panel. What I'm going to do here is just see what's in this component. And it's just telling me that this is a list of 2 lines. So we have line index 0. All lists start with an index 0 and a line index 1. So when you're doing computer programming or anything with writing code, all lists, everything basically starts at 0 instead of 1. So when we're numbering items, we always start with 0. And so that's why you see this 0 here, and this is a line, and a 1 here, and this is the second line. So D1 is going to be 0, D2 is going to be 1. D in this case just stands for data, so anything you want to put in here, you can merge it together, any kind of data. In this case, it's a line. Let's delete that. And to make a surface between these 2 lines, we need the loft component. So I'm going to double click and type loft, and this takes in curves. The C is a curve input. And we have 2 curves in here, and this takes in a list of curves. And so you can have 2 curves or as many curves as you want. If you have 1 curve, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to loft it because it has nothing to make in between those, or in between just 1 curve. But since we have 2 curves, it's going to make a surface between those 2 curves. If we had more curves, it would make a surface between more curves, and it would do them in an order based on the list that they're coming in. So in this case, it's going from 0, it's going from this curve to this curve, this one to this one, and just making a surface between them. So I'm going really slow right now because I know how confusing it can be when you're first coming into Grasshopper. I'll start to speed up a little bit as we go along, but obviously just pause and rewind if you need to. But now we're basically done with our first part of this tutorial, which is just make a simple surface. And we're going to make several other surfaces, some slightly more interesting surfaces. And for each surface, we're going to make a custom component, which in this case is just a collection of these components. And so we're just going to put all of these into one component that makes a flat surface. And I'll show you what that looks like. But what we need to do in order to make this simple surface creating component is make sure we have all the inputs and outputs of that component. So you can see like here we have data 1, data 2, and R, what is this result? Okay, so there are 2 inputs and 1 output. Here there are 2 inputs. The O here is loft options, which we don't need to worry about now, but so there are 2 inputs, 1 output. So for our component, we are going to want a point as an input. So this is going to be 1 input. We're going to have an X and a Y direction for our first move vector so that we can adjust this. And so that's going to be one input, 2, 3, and 4. We're going to want the Z that's going to determine the height of our surface. And then we'll want at least 1 output, which is going to be the surface. We're going to put all of this into one component, and this is a handy thing to do when your Grasshopper script is getting bigger and bigger, to put little sections into their own components. And so the first thing I need to do is get an output. So I'm going to put this loft component, since it's outputting a surface, into its own surface component. And I'm going to label this as flat surface. And so now this surface is in this component. It's also here, but we don't need to see any of this anymore. So I'm going to turn those previews off, and I'm going to copy this and put it over there. So I just clicked Alt and dragged a new one over there. I'm going to hide this also. And the reason I'm doing this is all of this and everything to the left is going to be in a component, and this is going to be the output to our surface. And then I need to drag all of the inputs over to the left. So everything that I don't want in the component, I need to pull over here. And so I'm going to get a number, type in number, and get this number component here. And this is going to be the height. So I'm going to rename this height. I'm going to copy this so I can also name this slider height. That way I know what I'm changing when I change this. I'm changing the height of the surface. And then I need to plug this into our Z vector. And so I can pull these over here. And then I'm going to do the same thing for these. I'm going to get two more number components. I'm going to type this, I'm going to call this move X and copy that and call this move Y. Put the X component, the X slider into that component, Y into that one, and then connect these to the X and Y values for our vector. And again, I'm going to copy this and put it on the number slider. That way I know what this number slider is doing. So we have a move X, a move Y, and a height. If I highlight all three of these together and click either this arrow or this arrow, it's going to align them. So I click the left arrow, it's going to align them all to the left. And if I click this, it's going to make them equidistant vertically. And so that's just a way to organize things if you want. So now it looks like we have all that we need for our inputs. Our inputs are going to be start point, move X, move Y, and height. And our output is going to be flat surface. And so if we highlight everything in between, everything that isn't an input or an output, and then we do the middle button click again, the same thing that you do if you want to hide or preview, but we go up to this little folder here that's called cluster. It's going to put all of this into a single component. And we have our inputs and our output. And nothing is previewed inside this component. So if we click on it, nothing turns green, but we can unpreview it anyways. You don't have to. Anyway, so now we have everything in this much smaller compact form. And if we want to change any of the inputs and get a different surface, change the height. Okay, so that's a quick flat surface. And we will save this for later and start to make a few more surfaces. The next surface we'll make, in the next video, we'll make a curvy surface.